John Brodsky and Christina Musan. Making sense of the madness. Brodsky and Musan. Now.
Good morning. This is Brodsky and Musan on KMJ. I'm John Brodsky.
And I'm Christina Musan.
Hey, Christina. We have a special guest this hour, Janie Peterson. She is the sister-in-law of Scott Peterson. Want to remind people about the Scott Peterson case, which was almost 20 years ago now, 2002. Lacey Peterson went missing on Christmas Eve when Scott went fishing. And it was a big case.
Yes.
Because it was right here, Modesto.
Right.
And
right in our backyard.
Ended up having Fresno connections. And a lot of people thought Scott was guilty, but one person who didn't was Janie Peterson. Janie, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Now, Scott's been in the news because there are appeals going on, and his conviction is being appealed, and his death penalty has been overturned. Where are we going with the court cases that are going on now?
Well, there's two processes happening. The first is his appeal, and the second is called a habeas petition. The appeal dealt with anything that might have gone wrong in the courtroom. And that, when the California Supreme Court ruled on Scott's appeal in August, they found that there was an error made in the courtroom, and it was made by the judge during the jury selection process. He was removing jurors simply because they were against the death penalty, even though those jurors indicated that they could still implement the death penalty. And if that's the case, those jurors needed to remain in the jury pool. So the law that the underlying law of that situation goes all the way back to the 1960s, and it's a ruling by the United States Supreme Court. So the California Supreme Court overturned Scott's death sentence based on that error that the judge made. And then additionally, you have this other process going on. Scott's appellate attorneys filed a habeas petition, and that deals with things outside of what the court record shows. Any new investigation, anything you find out that happened outside of the record. And what the issue they are dealing with there is a jury misconduct issue. It was found out that a juror completed her questionnaire inaccurately. All potential jurors were asked if they'd ever been involved in a lawsuit, if they'd ever testified as a witness, or if they'd ever been a victim to a crime. And this particular juror answered no to all those questions, and the answer was actually yes. So that's a jury misconduct issue, and that the California Supreme Court has ordered that, has basically sent that back down to the San Mateo Superior Court and said, we need to take a closer look at this. If in fact the court finds there's a jury misconduct issue, then Scott's guilty verdict will be overturned. And so those are the two different paths that have both part of the appellate process. They're both kind of playing out at the same time, creating a little bit of confusion, but and they both deal with jury issues. So that's kind of where we're at.
Okay, so there is the possibility that Scott's verdict could be overturned here, and he would then they would have to decide to do a new trial?
Exactly. So if the jury misconduct issue overturns his guilty verdict, then we would start all over and select a new jury, and Scott would be retried again. All the witnesses would be called. The other thing is that based on the August ruling where they only overturned his death sentence, the Stanislaus County District Attorney's Office announced last Friday that they do intend to pursue putting Scott back on death row. And the process to do that is to seat a jury, have that jury hear all the evidence. That jury will not get to decide guilt or innocence. That jury will only get to decide whether Scott will be sentenced to life without parole or whether he will be sentenced to death again. So there's some hearings coming up on that issue next week, and what's probably going to happen is that is going to be put on hold until the other issue with the jury misconduct that might overturn the entire thing until that is dealt with. That's kind of a little bit of what's going on.
We're talking with Janie Peterson, who is the sister-in-law to Scott Peterson. And Janie, when do you think the San Mateo court then will come back with a decision on the verdict itself or the overturning?
Sure. The timeline for that, the next deadline in that process is November 13th, and that's a filing deadline. So the state, which I think the filing will be submitted by the district attorney of Stanislaus County, and they will present their evidence, probably arguing that there was not jury misconduct. That filing is due by November 13th. Then Scott's attorneys will have 1 month till December 13th to file a response. The San Mateo court will then take a look at all the evidence before them. And again, this is strictly evidence about jury misconduct. It has absolutely nothing to do with evidence in the case. It's only evidence surrounding the jury misconduct. The San Mateo court will make a ruling. Was there misconduct? Was there not? And no matter which way they rule, either side, whether it's Scott or the district attorney of Stanislaus County, is going to appeal that to the California Supreme Court. So it'll get appealed to the California Supreme Court, and they will either uphold or reverse the decision. So they're also in there after both those filings are made. The San Mateo court might actually have hearings and call witnesses to testify. So witnesses could be sworn in. This particular juror could be called to the stand to testify. They might potentially call other witnesses to testify. So the whole process is definitely going to take a few months. We're probably, there's really no set time frame, but in reality, there probably will not be a decision before the turn of the year on the new trial.
Okay, having said all that, you're hoping that you get a new trial. It could happen. You believe that there is new evidence to be presented that will show that Scott is innocent. You believe that he's innocent, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So you guys have some new evidence. What is the best piece of evidence that you have that would prove that he's not guilty?
Well, I think this case centers around the timeline of the crime. There's so much evidence the morning of December 24th that Laci was alive, and that evidence is just ignored and completely overlooked. And it's for a number of reasons, but as time goes on, there's no good reasons left. There's no reasons to be ignoring all this evidence that Laci was alive. There's evidence all throughout the house that she was alive the morning of December 24th. She put the leash on their dog, and she walked him around the neighborhood the morning of December 24th. Multiple neighbors saw her. None of those neighborhood witnesses who reported seeing Laci walking the dog the morning of December 24th were ever had a face-to-face interview with a detective in this case. I mean, that's stunning. And then you go on to have a tip come in that of a lieutenant at a prison in California overhearing a conversation that Laci confronted or encountered burglars who were burglarizing a house directly across the street from Laci, and that house was in fact burglarized. So there's so much evidence that she was alive the morning of December 24th, and Scott left the house at 10 a.m. and that's evidence that he's innocent because she's still alive.
So these witnesses that saw her that never garnered an interview with the police, how did you discover that?
Well, we actually knew about them at trial. So because you have access to the police reports and the tips. One of the problems at trial was just the timeline of the morning, and a neighbor had found Scott and Laci's dog in the street with the leash on, and she put the dog back in the yard, just after 10 a.m. And a lot of these people saw Laci after 10 a.m., like maybe 10:30, later in the morning, and far enough away that it didn't make sense that she could have, if this neighbor's putting the dog back in the yard, how did Laci have time to go for a 45-minute walk? And so the assumption that was made at the time of trial was that this woman put the dog back. There was no time for Laci to have gone on a walk, that whatever happened to Laci happened before this woman put the dog back. And what we know now is that this woman put the dog back before Laci went on her walk. And that's due to it's not new evidence, but it was newly found evidence. It just kind of got lost in the 48,000 pages of reports that the police handed over. It was a handwritten report, which added to the problem that it got lost, because when you're searching 48,000 pages, you're searching typed words to, and this report was handwritten, and it basically it was the mailman saying that he came by the house at about 10:30 that morning, and the gate was open and the dog wasn't at the property. So what that says is that as the morning played out, what happened is Laci went outside to walk the dog. She leashed him up. She stepped back in the house to grab a jacket. The dog walked out in the front. The neighbor put the dog back in the yard. Laci came out, walked the dog. She's seen by all the neighbors. The gate's open. The mailman sees the gate open. And then it also, it gives so much more context to the timeline of the morning. It also validates that this encountering the burglars, because that was discounted at trial as well, because the neighbors across the street did not leave until 10:30 in the morning that day.
Let me ask you about
better
this.
understanding of all the evidence that we've always had.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you about the timeline, because you're talking about 10 o'clock and this stuff, because I guess the police theory was that Scott killed Laci overnight or sometime and then took her body out of the house they have some kind of timeline for him, and these times you're talking about prove that she was seen after their timeline. Is that right?
Correct. I mean, actually, no one in this case, whether it's the police or the prosecutors, have ever asserted a time. At the beginning of Scott's trial, they stated that Scott killed Laci the evening of the 23rd or sometime overnight. When evidence came out in trial that Laci was on the computer the morning of December 24th at 8:30 a.m. in the house, the prosecution just said, well, it doesn't matter, he still did it. So they really don't give a timeline, but part of their theory is that he's dragging her body out of their house in the morning, and that morning Scott's truck was parked in their driveway, with the tailgate towards the street. Witnesses saw his car behind, parked near the street, tailgate towards the street, and if you believe their timeline, you have to believe that he's, dragging his wife's dead body out of their house and putting it in the bed of his pickup truck in broad daylight. And it just, there's nothing about this case that makes sense. They can't timeline it out, and you can't, because it doesn't fit the evidence.
All right, we're talking with Janie Peterson, the sister-in-law of Scott Peterson, about her theories about what really happened to Laci Peterson. And we've got a lot more to talk about. Got to take a break here, and we'll be back. Broski and Moussan on KMJ.
Broski and Moussan here on KMJ. We're talking with Janie Peterson this morning. She is the sister-in-law of Scott Peterson. And we're talking about the appeals cases that are up before local courts and the Supreme Court as well. And Janie, you had mentioned in the first segment of the show about this burglary that took place across the street from the Petersons' home. And let's talk a little bit more about that. What exactly happened there?
Well, directly across the street from Scott and Laci's home was the Medinas. The Medinas lived across the street, and they left Christmas Eve morning about 10:30 a.m. to go visit their son in Los Angeles for Christmas. And that's the same day that Laci went missing. And when they returned on December 26th, this is the Medinas, when the Medinas returned on December 26th, about 2 days later at 4 p.m. in the afternoon, they could tell by driving into town that something had happened in Modesto. They saw the national news trucks, they saw the satellite booms, and And as they got home, they realized that whatever happened on their street because there was such a large media presence. There was actually police there. When the Medinas got out of their car and approached their home, they saw that their side door had been kicked in, and they didn't even have to call the police. They just walked out into their driveway and said, "We've been robbed." And there was actually police standing in the street in front of their house because the police were actually getting ready to serve a search warrant on Scott and Lacey's home due to Lacey's disappearance. So what they found out over the coming days is that a neighbor of the Medinas and the Petersons had reported, she reported that she had seen a van in front of the Medina home the morning of December 24th at around 11 a.m. and that there was three men with that van, and just that they looked suspicious. And that information was put on a reward flyer. The police sought to solve the Medina burglary, and they did in fact get a tip on who committed the burglary. They were given some names, and they arrested two of the men. That they were given multiple names, but they made 2 arrests, questioned those men. Those men said that the burglary happened on the 26th, and the police took their word for it. So the evidence you have that the burglary actually happened on the 24th, the day Lacey went missing, is the fact that you have an eyewitness who drove by saying she saw 3 men in a van in front of the Medina home the morning of the 24th. You have this later tip that comes in from the Norco prison from Lieutenant Aponte saying, "Hey, I have an inmate here who's on the phone talking about Lacey Peterson confronting a burglary on her street." That further corroborated that the burglary happened on the 24th. And then you also had the lack of opportunity for it to happen on the 26th, because on Scott and Lacey Street on December 26th, you had a national media presence. There were satellite trucks all up and down the street, and I believe even the Medinas had to show their driver's license to get onto the street to go home that day. So this burglary was not a smash and grab. This burglary, they took a large safe that was removed from the house with a dolly or a hand truck, multiple tools, thousands of dollars worth of jewelry. There were guns taken. This was not a run in and run out. There was a lot of items taken from this home, and if it was done on the 26th or even the burglars assert it was about 6:30, around 6 a.m. on the 26th, and there was already media present on the street the morning of December 26th.
So you have an eyewitness that saw these burglars they said 11, about 11 in the morning?
Yes.
On the 20?
11, I want to say 11:10, but I could be wrong. Just
but around
after
11
o'clock.
Around 11 in the morning on the 24th, an eyewitness.
Yes.
The burglars themselves say, no, it wasn't on the 24th. It was on the 26th at 6 a.m.
Yes.
And the police believe that?
Yes.
Okay, so the end of investigation or what?
End of investigation. And that the tip from Lieutenant Aponte came in like 3 weeks, 2 weeks later. So they didn't have the tip from Lieutenant Aponte yet. But what's interesting about the Lieutenant Aponte from the prison is he says that he actually had to call twice. So he didn't get a return phone call from his first tip. So he calls a second time. And the second time, he has signed an affidavit saying that he spoke with someone from the Modesto Police Department, that he made a recording of the phone call, and that he spoke with Modesto Police about it, that Modesto Police interviewed this inmate via phone. And where we sit today is that the Modesto Police Department claims they have no record of ever calling and speaking with that inmate. They claim they have no record of ever receiving the recorded phone call, and we don't have that recorded phone call. It's gone. So it was a critical piece of evidence that was completely ignored. So not only do you have the police ignoring all the neighborhood witnesses who are seeing Lacey walk the dog, there's no follow-up Aponte tip. And then you also had, Lacey was wearing jewelry when she went missing, and one of the pieces of jewelry she was wearing was a Croton watch that she had inherited from her grandmother. Well, in about 2 months after Lacey went missing, police were searching pawn records, and they found a pawn record that a Croton watch had been pawned on December 31st at a pawn shop about a mile from Lacey's home. And they found that ticket, and then there's no follow-up. They did absolutely nothing to follow up. There's no record in the 48,000 pages of discovery that they went to follow up on that Croton watch. And what's really interesting is that there was a series on A&E, which now you can watch on Hulu. It's called The Murder of Laci Peterson. And at one point, they showed some extra scenes, and they only aired these extra scenes that they filmed once. But one of those extra scenes was an interview with this pawn shop owner. And this pawn shop owner said that he was contacted by the Modesto police and was asked to put the watch on hold. Well, there's no police report about that. That police report's never been handed over. So either they didn't follow up on the watch, or they followed up and they're not handing over the follow-up. So there's just too many unanswered questions in this case.
All right, we're talking with Janie Peterson. She is the sister-in-law to Scott Peterson.
Janie, I just want to ask you, we're talking about this burglary. You're talking about this lieutenant in the prison who overheard this conversation. Are people like that and these witnesses that saw Lacey walking her dog after she was supposedly dead, are these people available to testify?
They should be, yes. There's a few of the witnesses who saw Lacey that morning who have passed away, but most of these witnesses would be very likely called to testify if there's another trial, whether that trial be for the penalty phase or whether it be a whole new trial to determine guilt. So yes, they would very likely be called to testify.
But you are convinced, based on these eyewitnesses who saw Lacey walking her dog that morning, and the timeline with the mailman and the neighbor across the street, and this burglary information, that proves to you that Scott could not have done this.
Correct.
And there's
Correct.
more, right?
And there is more. There is more. One of the other tips that I hadn't brought up yet was one we just actually released to the public this year. We put it on our Facebook page. We have a website, a Facebook page, Instagram, Twitter, if you want to follow or kind of get more information on any of the things that I've talked about. But one of the tips that we just released a few months ago is a tip that came in through America's Most Wanted. In early January, America's Most Wanted ran a story on Lacey's disappearance. And a tipster called in and basically had overheard two people talking about, not even overheard, he had a conversation with two men talking about Lacey's murder. And he named those men. And America's Most Wanted deemed it as a 100% credible tip. It named suspects, it named circumstances. And the Modesto police their follow-up was to go attempt to talk to one of the people named in the tip. And the guy said he'd been in jail on December 24th, and that was basically the end of the investigation. So another tip that just didn't get followed up on as it should have been, that was bringing in information about what did happen to Lacey.
What do you think of the Modesto Police Department?
What do I think? I think they woefully investigated this case. And I think there's way too many questions that are not answered for someone to be on death row. I don't think you can talk about this case without also talking about, where Lacey and Connor's bodies were found. Scott went fishing on December 24th, the day they went missing, and 4 months later, he went fishing in the Bay Area. And 4 months later in April, that's where, Lacey and Connor's bodies, they were found separate, about a mile or so apart, but they were found on the shore of the San Francisco Bay and to a lot of people that closes this case. Their bodies were found where he went fishing. But it needs to be noted that Scott's alibi was immediately and widely publicized by Christmas morning that he had gone fishing in the bay. And it was of great concern to us that the police were releasing that information because we didn't know who had Laci and we didn't know what their intent was. And so we had a fear that by releasing this information, that whoever took her, if they had an intent to harm her, that they would put her body where he said he was. And so when that is actually what happened 4 months later, that wasn't to us. That didn't mean Scott was guilty. That meant someone took advantage of his publicized alibi. So that needs to be pointed out. I think people, you have to kind of take the whole package of how it played out when you look at the circumstance of where their bodies were found.
We're talking with Janie Peterson, who's the sister-in-law to Scott Peterson. Janie, let me ask you then, is what you think happened is that she confronted the robbers and that she was kidnapped and held for a time potentially and then killed with her and, their son's body dumped in the bay? Is that kind of a very simplified version, but is that what you think happened?
There's more evidence that happened than there is evidence that Scott murdered Laci and Connor. And until it's, properly investigated, when you're on the defense side of things, when you're a defendant and you're hiring private investigators, how you can investigate a crime is not even close to the resources that a police department has or the government has to investigate a crime. So, we're having to come at this from a very different angle and perspective than if the Modesto police would have done it right the first time.
We can't finish this conversation without bringing up Scott's affair with Amber Fry and the fact that he was talking to her after his wife went missing. What do you think about his whole affair and how that impacted this?
And perception as well, the public's perception.
Yeah. Well, first, there's no excuse that we make no excuse for Scott's infidelity. And unfortunately, though, that I believe that is what led to him being convicted of murder. If you look at, there was a whole lot of evidence that Scott was an adulterer. He traveled for work for a living. And unfortunately, he was weak when it came to women. And you put those two things together, and Scott was unfaithful. So I think when Laci went missing, and Amber found out about it, she went to the police, rightfully so, and said, hey, I've been seeing this guy who told me he wasn't married, and he's clearly married. And, the police asked Amber to start recording their phone calls, and she did that. And so yeah, when you listen to those phone calls, it's what you're listening to is someone who is being prompted by the police to call, to record the calls, and Scott is recounting to her a lot of the lies that he told her while he was seeing her. Scott had lied to Amber and said he wasn't married, and so pretty much everything Scott said to Amber was a lie. And so what you're hearing on those phone calls are all the lies. They're infidelity lies is what they are, but those lies were used to convict him of murder. If you look at the circumstances around this murder allegedly occurred on December 24th, 2002. And every single thing that Scott said to Modesto Police or Department of Justice people who interviewed him, everything Scott said about the circumstances of December 24th to the police is true. There's not one lie to law enforcement about the events of December 24th. Scott's lies are about Amber, and they're to Amber.
Were there any things in those Amber conversations that linked him with any kind of guilt here? Or was there anything? And There was a lot of tape, as I recall, of her conversations.
Yeah. There's not. In fact, I think at some point in early February, the phone calls ceased or the wiretap ended. I don't know which. There was a point where Amber said, "I don't think we should talk anymore," and they never spoke again because she wasn't initiating the phone calls. So, no, there was no evidence presented of any. In fact, in the phone calls, you hear Amber threaten Scott, "I'm going to go to the cops," and he says, "If that's what you need to do, that's what you need to do. You need to do. I'm not going to try to stop you." So there comes a point in the phone calls the first week of the phone calls, she's pretending she doesn't know he's married and his wife is missing. And after about a week of phone calls, he admits to her, "Look, I'm married. My wife is missing." And they do continue to talk at that point, but it's more him, it's basically her interrogating him, what's going on. And so at that point, the phone calls are a little more reality based as far as there's an acknowledgement that he's married, that Lacey's missing, and the conversations do continue in that context. And that's, Scott feels he owes Amber an explanation, and he certainly did.
There was also some curious reporting about Scott when he was arrested. California Attorney General Bill Lockyer said, they thought he might be trying to flee to Mexico. There were reports that he was found with a lot of money. He dyed his hair. He had a goatee. What about all that? It seemed like peculiar behavior around his arrest.
Mm-hmm. That's something that is explained really well in the Murder of Laci Peterson on Hulu or A&E, but basically what you had happening is, Scott had really almost become nomadic. He was kind of chased out of his own home. He was, coming to Southern California. Most of his family, we all live in San Diego, and he was coming down to San Diego to spend weekends with us, and he was, kind of living out of his car. As far as his appearance goes, he didn't look much different than he looked when police served a second search warrant on his home in February. He was becoming a very recognizable person. He was on the cover of the National Enquirer every week, and he did do things to, change his hair color, and, he grew a goatee, but it certainly wasn't to evade law enforcement. And there was, the day of his arrest, he was being followed, and he perceived he was being followed by media. So, the officers that were following him were in unmarked cars, and he was actually noting all the license plate numbers. He had done the same thing the week before and was giving the numbers to his attorney, saying, "I'm being followed by these people. Here's the license plate numbers." So Scott really perceived he was being followed by media. The day of his arrest, he was arrested near Torrey Pines Golf Course in San Diego. That's 30 miles from the Mexican border. I think when you hear something like that on the national news, that Scott Peterson is arrested 30 miles from the Mexican border, I don't think your average American knows that San Diego sits on the Mexican border. I mean, I'm talking to you today from probably 23 miles from the Mexican border. So it becomes a narrative. Scott Peterson arrested, 30 miles from the Mexican border, and it created this perception of flight. But when you listen to the testimony, there's not any law enforcement officer who testified that they felt Scott was going to flee.
Janie Peterson, thanks so much for your time this morning. Before we say goodbye, I would just want to give you an opportunity. If anybody wants to, I read your blog this morning. Very interesting. You lay out a very good case, as you did here on the air. And so if anybody wants to go to the website or the Facebook page, how do they do that?
Basically, on most formats, our name is Scott Peterson Appeal. So our website is scottpetersonappeal.org. That will link you to our Facebook page, our Instagram page, our Twitter. I think we probably have the most information on our Facebook page, but also the website we've had since 2005. There's articles on there that kind of go through the evidence in the case bit by bit, and you can this case has a lot of detail, and we've done a lot of investigating and we've done a lot of explaining, and so those are all different ways that you can see and see what we have to say. And then additionally, you can watch The Murder of Laci Peterson. It's available on Amazon, on Hulu, and I believe it's also on demand on A&E. It's a 6-part docuseries that came out in 2017, and it gives a lot of different perspectives. It has jurors on there. It has detectives on there. There's interviews with our family. The witness who saw the van the morning of December 24th was interviewed. Witnesses who saw Laci walking the dog were interviewed. So there's plenty there if you want to find out more information.
Janie, thank you very much for taking the time. Appreciate it very much.
Sure thing. Thank you.
All right, Janie Peterson, Scott Peterson's sister-in-law, a firm believer in Scott's innocence and is working for this new trial, which could happen. Looks like it might happen. Got to take a break here, though, on KMJ.
Broski Musan here on KMJ. Thanks again to Janie Peterson for taking the time to talk with us this morning in this hour. Scott Peterson's sister-in-law, she mentioned that A&E documentary, The Murder of Laci Peterson. I don't want to ignore this. It was a listener when the breaking news came down that the state Supreme Court had overturned Scott Peterson's death penalty verdict. It was a listener who called and told us about that A&E documentary. John, you went and watched it. You came in and you said, I think there might be a story here to tell. We reached out to Janie Peterson, and she agreed to come on. So thanks to a listener, that's actually what led us to having her on the air today.
Yeah, and I think if you ask most people, like if we did a buzz question, I think 90+% believe that Scott is guilty. I am not so sure anymore. There's more that we didn't even get to here.
Right. It's a lot. So The Murder of Laci Peterson, it's on A&E. She said you could find it on Hulu, maybe even Amazon. And even if you want to check out the blog, whether you think he's innocent or not, it's a very interesting read. And scottpetersonappeals.org. Yeah,
and on Facebook, just Scott Peterson Appeal. You can find it easily. Or Janie Peterson. That's how we found her.
Yeah.
On her own page. So there's a lot more to this story. There'll be a lot of evidence brought into court that wasn't there last time. And it's called Reasonable Doubt, right?
Right.
That's one of the episode names
That's
of one
right.
of the 6 parts.
That's the last episode.
But we're out of time.